You were always a mistake. We were just trying to be polite." Father said this calmly, almost wearily, without raising his voice. It was the kind of statement you'd hear about the weather or a wobbly shelf in the garage, something that's just become accepted as fact. He didn't even look at me. His gaze drifted past, towards the wallpaper above my head. I stood at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee in my hands. It was already lukewarm. A sudden, irrational fear gripped me, that if I loosened my fingers just a bit, it would slip and shatter, and that the sound of it breaking would be louder than anything that had happened to me in the last few years. "What?" I asked, though I'd heard every syllable of his words perfectly. My mother sat at the table, meticulously folding napkins, one by one. It was her way when she didn't want to engage, when she couldn't quite bring herself to leave. "Don't start," she said, not lifting her eyes. "We've already gone on long enough." I'd only been home for 3 days. Iowa greeted me with a gray sky and the same smell, a blend of dust, old wood, and my mother's cleaning products. Nothing had changed, except me perhaps, though they didn't seem to notice. "I just wanted to be honest," he continued. "You're an adult now. It's time to stop pretending." The word pretending hit me like a small, sharp pain. I'd spent my entire life trying to be agreeable, not arguing, not drawing attention to myself, not demanding anything. I'd learned early on how to read the mood in the house, by the way my father took his steps, by the sound of the closing door, by the way my mother set the dishes on the table. Mistakes weren't tolerated. "And what mistake is that?" I asked. Finally, he looked at me. There was no anger in his eyes, just a dull, persistent irritation, like a headache that wouldn't go away. "You always complicate things," he said, his voice almost detached. It felt like he was reciting a phrase he'd prepared long ago, running it through his mind repeatedly. Something shifted inside me, a subtle, unsettling movement. It wasn't a breaking. It was more like a piece of something that had been poorly fitted, suddenly loose. I didn't yet understand what they were planning. I still clung to the idea that this was just a blunt, hurtful comment, a consequence of exhaustion, a badly timed conversation. I couldn't have imagined then that within weeks they would be looking me directly in the eye and insisting that I was to blame, that they had proof. And that evening, I simply placed the mug in the sink. It didn't shatter, unfortunately. That night, I barely slept. The house creaked, as it always did, but every sound seemed amplified: the footsteps of my father down the hallway, the click of the light switch, the rush of water from the bathroom. I lay in my old room, staring at the ceiling, where a dark stain from a leak, a decade old, still lingered. They never bothered to cover it up, like so much else. In the morning, there was no mention of yesterday at breakfast. It was their way, a swift strike, followed by a carefully crafted facade of indifference. My mother placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me, as if I were still a schoolgirl rushing to catch the bus. "Where are you going today?" my father asked, not looking up from his newspaper. "To the city. I have a meeting," I replied. It was only half true. I was going to stop by the office where I used to freelance and pick up some documents. I didn't tell them I was looking for a job here in Iowa. Not because it was a secret, just because I knew they wouldn't care. "Try not to be late," my mother said. "We need to discuss something important tonight." I nodded. The word "we" sounded like an accidental inclusion. In the car, I found myself repeating my father's phrase over and over, trying to unravel its hidden meaning. Mistake! Not coincidence, not problem. An error, something to be fixed, or erased. The city was just as I remembered it. Neat, dull, suffocatingly safe. I drove to the office, retrieved the papers, exchanged a few pleasantries with a former colleague. She asked how long I was staying. I shrugged. It was an honest answer. When I returned home, my father was already waiting in the living room. He was sitting perfectly upright, his hands folded in his lap. My mother stood by the window. "Sit down," he said. I obeyed. Between us stood a coffee table, empty, like a stage before a bad play. "We decided to be honest with you," my mother began. "It's important for all of us." All of us sounded odd again. "About the incident," my father continued. "Don't you remember?" I frowned. "What incident?" They exchanged a glance, quick, practiced. "Don't play games," he said. "You were there, you signed the documents." My fingers went cold. "I don't understand what you're talking about." "You understand," he said calmly, "and soon you'll have to confirm it." At that moment, a genuine fear gripped me, not sharp or frantic, but slow, viscous. The kind that doesn't shout, but slowly constricts. I didn't yet know the details, but I already understood. Yesterday's words weren't a burst of anger. They were a warning. The house felt different after that conversation. Not in the details, but in the air itself. It was as if the walls held a secret I hadn't known existed. My mother no longer asked about my day, she simply didn't bother. My father had become unnervingly polite, almost formal. It was worse than shouting, a silent, chilling weight. On the third day, I overheard them. I was walking down the hallway when I heard my name. "She won't make it," my mother said, her voice flat. "Have you seen her face?" "She will," my father replied, his tone precise. "She has no choice." I froze, rooted to the spot. "What if she refuses?" my mother asked, her voice barely a whisper. My father smiled, a cold, brittle expression. "Where would she go? The documents are signed. The cameras are running. We're the witnesses." I retreated as quietly as I'd arrived, my heart hammering against my ribs, yet strangely clear-headed. They were talking about me as if I were a problem to be solved by someone else. That evening, my father placed a folder on the table. "Read this." Inside were copies of contracts and reports' financial documents. I recognized my signature instantly, not because I remembered signing it, but because it felt utterly foreign. Neat, precise, the way I'd sign when someone told me it was simply a formality. "It's not what you think," my father said. "Just a minor tax optimization." "It's illegal," I stated, my voice firm. My mother sighed. "Don't be dramatic, everyone does it." "Not everyone steals their children," I countered, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. My father slammed his hand on the table. "You were involved, voluntarily. Now please don't ruin our lives." The word "our" hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "And my life?" I asked, the question a raw plea. He looked at me, his gaze cold and assessing. "You never were much to begin with." I understood then that they'd already made their decision. My role was simple, to take the blame if anything went wrong. And it already was. That night, I sat in my room, staring at the copies of the documents. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now overlaid with something sharper anger. Pure, unadulterated rage. It was the first time I hadn't thought about survival, but about escape. And the realization that perhaps the mistake wasn't me. The next morning, there was a short, sharp knock on the door. I was pouring coffee, and for a brief, disorienting moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But my father was already entering the hallway, adjusting his tie. "Sit down," he said, tossing a casual glance my way. I didn't move. Standing on the threshold were two people, a man in a dark jacket and a woman with a tablet. They showed their credentials. Financial oversight. I saw my father's cheek flush, the only visible sign that he wasn't entirely in control. "We'd like to ask a few questions," the woman said. "It concerns a company registered in the name of your daughter." My father didn't even turn around. "She's aware. It's her project." A wave of nausea washed over me, but I spoke with a carefully controlled voice. "I didn't register anything myself." My mother appeared behind me too quickly. "She's nervous. She always is. But she signed the papers." The woman looked at me directly, not with sympathy, not with hostility, but with a chilling neutrality. "We'd like to speak alone." My father stepped forward. "There's no need." "There is," she replied calmly. We sat at the kitchen table. I stared at the familiar scratch on the edge of the table, and suddenly it all clicked into place. If I stayed silent, everything would end. For them, a neat resolution. For me, a permanent exile. "They told me it was just a formality," I said, my voice steady. "I didn't have access to the accounts. I didn't make any decisions." "But you signed," the woman pressed. "Yes." The word hung in the air, a sentence of condemnation. But I continued, and I was misled. After they left, my father remained silent for a long time. Then he said, "You just made a huge mistake." I looked at him, my gaze unwavering. "No, I just stopped being useful." For the first time in a long time, I didn't retreat to my room. I stayed, sitting at the kitchen table, my back straight, as they gathered their papers and whispered amongst themselves. I knew the pressure would come, the threats, the attempts to break me back down. But now I had something more important, the truth. and I wasn't going to give it back to them. After the inspector's visit, my father stopped pretending. The polite facade crumbled, revealing a sharp, uncomfortable core. He spoke in clipped sentences, sometimes abruptly dismissing me as if I'd become a stranger, a threat. My mother adopted a different tactic, a slow, clinging silence. "You don't understand what you're getting into," she said that evening, when we were left alone in the kitchen. "They're not playing games. If it goes to court, they'll make you the fall guy." "You've already done it," I replied. She wrinkled her nose. "We're family, we're just trying to survive. At my expense." She looked at me with a weariness that held no regret. "You're stronger than you think. You'll get through this." I realized then it was her justification, that if I endured, everything would be right. The next day, I received a call, an unfamiliar number, a sterile voice. I was summoned for questioning. My father, hearing the exchange, simply nodded as if everything was unfolding according to plan. "Say what we discussed," he said later. "No one will dig deeper if you don't start." "What if they do?" I asked. He smiled, a chillingly detached expression. "Then you'll claim you acted independently. You're an adult." The room was cold, a sterile gray. I sat opposite a man with a file, catching myself counting the cracks in the wall. When he posed the first question, my voice trembled. But then I remembered his gaze, his pronouncement of an error, and something solidified within me. "I need protection," I said, "and a lawyer." He raised an eyebrow. "From whom?" "From the people who registered everything in my name," I replied. "I have their names." When I stepped out of the building, my hands shook. I felt no triumph, only a heavy weight settling upon me. But it was my weight, not one imposed. That evening, my father learned. He didn't shout. He simply said, "You're destroying us." I looked at him and for the first time felt no guilt. "No," I replied. "I'm just not going to disappear anymore for your peace of mind." He turned away, and in that gesture there was more truth than in all his words. I understood then that the hardest trials lay ahead, but the path back was irrevocably closed. The process was agonizingly slow. Too slow for people who preferred to handle things quietly behind closed doors. My father began to disappear more and more, returning late with a face like stone. My mother almost stopped talking to me. She'd just leave little notes on the table, terse messages if she needed to say something. As if direct words could somehow be turned against her. The lawyer they assigned to me was a man of few words. He offered no promises of miracles, no talk of success. "We'll stick to the facts," he said, "and you need to be prepared for pressure. It often comes not from the system, but from those closest to you." He was right, of course. "You can still fix this," my mother said one night, standing in the doorway of my room. "You can admit you were wrong, that you misunderstood." "Fix it for whom?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately. "For us," she finally said, her voice low. I looked at her, and suddenly I saw it, she wasn't afraid of the law. She was terrified of losing the life she knew. And I, in this life, had always been a disposable piece, a footnote. "I won't lie anymore," I said. She left then, closing the door softly behind her. It was our last private conversation. At the hearing, my father was composed, confident. He spoke with a measured calm, the practiced tone of someone used to persuading. He called me impulsive, careless, prone to mistakes. He said he'd always worried about me, that he'd given me too much trust. I listened and realized that this was precisely how betrayals looked: neat, logical, almost convincing. When they called for my statement, I didn't offer excuses. I simply told them how it had happened. About the procedures, the lack of access, the relentless pressure. I didn't look at my parents. I spoke into the silence, knowing they were listening. After the session, my father caught me in the hallway. "Do you think anyone will stand by you now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You'll be alone." I looked at him, and a strange calm settled over me. "I've been alone for a long time," I said. "You've just noticed now." He didn't respond, and in that moment I understood. He was losing. Not just the case, but control. All that remained was waiting for the verdict. And for the first time in my life, the anticipation didn't feel quite so terrifying. The verdict came on Friday. The courtroom was almost empty. A scattering of staff, a few lawyers, my parents. No drama, no flash of cameras. It felt utterly mundane, as if we were discussing someone else's life entirely. The judge spoke for a long time, reciting documents and detailing testimony. I listened in a haze, catching fragments, lack of intent, misleading statements, responsibility of the organizers. When he finally pronounced the dismissal of charges against me, I didn't feel relief. Just a deep, honest weariness. My father paled. My mother stared at the floor. They were found responsible for the scheme and the false testimonies. It wasn't a victory, not a celebration, merely a diagnosis, a cold statement of fact. In the hallway, my mother reached for my hand. "We didn't want this to happen." I pulled my hand away. "But you were prepared for it," I said. My father stood a little apart. "You could have warned us," he said, his voice strained. "We would have found another way." "Of course," I replied. "Another mistake." He didn't say anything. Perhaps for the first time he didn't have the right words. A week later I moved out, without a fuss, without a farewell. I took only my belongings and the file, that same file that had started it all. The house remained standing, as it always had, but now it was irrevocably not mine. I found a small apartment in a neighboring town, secured a job ordinary, without ambition or grand titles. But there, people spoke to me as if I were a person, asked for my opinion. They didn't expect me to vanish. Sometimes I catch myself still waiting for the jolt, a phrase, a glance, a gesture. But they don't come. And each of those moments, small, precious victories. My father was right about one thing. There was indeed an error, just not the one he'd imagined. And for the first time in my life, I don't feel the need to be fixed.